Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Scope here on British Muslim TV with me, your host, Waqar Rizvi. Today, we're going to be discussing Palestinians as well as in Germany, I should say, as well as how exactly Germany views the issue of Palestine. We are, of course, being broadcast live wherever BMTV is broadcast via satellite, as well as, of course, on BMTV's various social media channels. You will, in a moment, and you do, in fact, see those numbers at the bottom of the screen right now. You can send us your comments during the show or after the show at any point for myself or the experts we are speaking to as well. So as I said, we're going to be discussing Germany's view on Palestine, and we know just recently the Palestinian poet and writer Muhammad al-Kurd was disinvited by the Goethe Institute, which is Germany's state-owned cultural association, for a now cancelled conference in Hamburg because he was deemed an inappropriate speaker. Al-Kurd has, of course, for many of us, as we know, has been an outspoken person on Palestinian issues, and his social media posts seem to have made his German hosts uncomfortable. Now, at the same time, we have also had pro-Palestine rallies being banned essentially and violently suppressed in Germany, both before and after the Palestinian-American journalist Shireen Abu Akleh's killing at the hands of Israeli forces in the occupied territories. Now, to many who discuss Germany's view on Palestine, they always talk about the historical context and say that justifies why the Germans are so pro-Israel. Now, to others on the opposite end, the opposite view holds true, where the Germans should, in fact, stand on the side of Palestinians and a just end to the occupation. We will discuss those issues as well as others with our esteemed panelists who are joining us live today from Germany. We're joined by Hebh, Jamal, who is a Palestinian writer and journalist, and we're also joined by Lobna Shammout, who is a member of the Palestine Speaks team. Lobna and Hebh, thank you both for taking your time out of your busy schedules to join us today here on The Scope. Hebh, I'd like to start with you, if I may, and just right at the top, I'd like to talk about Muhammad al-Kurd and the entire controversy around what happened at the Goethe Institute. What are your thoughts about that?
Sure. First off, thank you so much for having me. Here's the situation. Muhammad al-Kurd, as you said, was disinvited from Goethe Institute. And it's important to note that Goethe Institute is funded by the German Foreign Ministry. And the German Foreign Ministry essentially funds Goethe Institutes over 98 countries. Specifically, one of them is in Ramallah. And yeah, the situation is essentially, Palestinian suppression within the country in every aspect, be it cultural, be it through academia, be it through artists and social events. And the reason is because every single part of German life right now is actually funded by the German government. So be it any public space, if you want to book a public space, public events, etc., it's actually funded by the federal government, which is why German suppression of Palestinian voices is so prevalent.
Lobna, what are your thoughts about that? Because, one of the things that surprised me, Lobna, about this story was that it's not like Muhammad al-Kurd's views were not known. I mean, he is such a public figure, he's so popular on Twitter that it's not like Goethe Institute did not know who they were inviting. So why invite him and then remove the invitation? It sort of doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, it's not the first time that invitations are spoken and then returned. So people are uninvited as soon as somebody thinks about that they may be uncomfortable for the German history because they're Palestinian and because they're pro-Palestinian. So actually, it's more surprising that if somebody who's Palestinian or pro-Palestinian is invited and can speak up, is more surprising than having people uninvited. So it's for the Palestinian community in Germany, it's no surprise that he was uninvited like many others before.
Hebh, then let's talk about the reasons behind this. You alluded to that in your first answer, but as I mentioned in my intro as well, the historical context is always brought up when we're talking about Germany-Palestine relations, or even lack of, if I may say that. What do you make of that argument that the historical context is very important to justify essentially Germany's very pro-Israel stances?
It's an excuse. Of course. We have to remember that currently, right now, Germany wants to be involved in the world stage. They're funneling millions of dollars into the military. They want to become great again, right? They want to be a world power. Unfortunately, however, they have to reconcile with their murderous history that is the Nazi regime. And in order to do that, they have to essentially kind of, exalt all of their past sins. And by doing that, they want to like criminalize Palestinian existence. So they specifically take every Israeli talking point and implement it within German society. The German government calls Israel their reason of state. So questioning Israel's right to exist, anything deemed if you're called an anti-Zionist, you are therefore anti-Semitic in the eyes of the German government. Germany in 2019, actually, the German Bundestag passed an anti-BDS resolution, which essentially states that it is anti-Semitic to boycott Israel. And of course, throughout German courts, this is actually unconstitutional. Every time they've tried to implement this, it has been battled and confronted within the German court system, within the European system, because it's freedom of speech. But unfortunately, however, German institutions still do not care. They will exclude Palestinian voices in every instance in order to kind of exalt themselves from their past crimes, and to be this great power. In order to do that, Palestinians have then become their primary target to do so.
Yeah, and so I wanted to address that issue of anti-Semitism from the get-go, Lubna, because that is, of course, an accusation that comes up whenever Palestine comes up, right? Whenever the topic of Palestine comes up in any country, the immediate accusation is that of anti-Semitism. But as I well know, and as I'm sure, of course, you know better than me, there's a lot of even Jews who are anti-occupation and pro-peace and pro-justice for Palestinians in the occupied territories. What are your thoughts about that accusation of anti-Semitism and its validity or lack of in this case?
The biggest problem that I personally see is that the more anti-Semitism is used as excuse for being pro-Palestine, the more it actually hurts itself, because using anti-Semitism and abusing the word and the meaning of it just because you're pro-Palestine or you're supporting Palestine is actually helping the real anti-Semitism to grow in Germany. And that's a big problem, because it's easy to call on events or speakers, they're anti-Semites, they're against Israel, and it's been being connected that being against the Israeli politics is automatically being anti-Semite. And we're at the point in Germany now where every pro-Palestinian event, even if it's absolutely cultural and historical culture, what has nothing to do with the politics of today, is declined as anti-Semite event. And there are so many people who have are really scared from doing events or having speeches because they don't want to get in line with anti-Semites. But I think it's hurting the real anti-Semitism, and it's not doing well for the really bad anti-Semitism.
Indeed, and that's a good point, isn't it, Hebh? Because we know that there is actually anti-Semitism. There is actually a problem with right-wingers in even Germany, with white supremacists there. I've done a couple of shows on that in the past as well, and that is a worrying trend, in fact, which seemingly isn't being spoken about enough in Germany.
Yeah, I mean, we can take the actual, demonstrations that were occurring in Berlin. I mean, Berlin banned Nakba Day protests. But we have to remember that, not even a few months ago, they allowed right-wing, Nazi-supporting, neo-Nazi rallies to take place in Berlin. Right. Like, I mean, it's a complete, hypocrisy, really, that in Germany, a country where with their past, they don't have much problem with right-wing neo-Nazis as they do with Palestinians. For them, and even in official documents sometimes, Palestinian is often conflated with the word anti-Semitism, which is, which is insane.
I'm wondering then, Lubna, at this point then, for the Palestinians, because the space to be able to speak is becoming essentially non-existent, right? Because after the break, we will also talk in greater detail about the rallies. But I wonder, what is then the solution at this point? If we're not going to have institutes inviting Palestinians to speak openly or as they should be allowed to with freedom of expression, what is the solution here then?
It's hard. It's hard to be working like a collective like Palestine Speaks is. We're German-wide and we're getting more and more and more. But if we don't get the chance to speak up, we're missing the chance to educate people, to even let them know that being pro-Palestinian or pro-Palestine is not the same as being anti-Semite, and that you can criticize the politics of Israel without being against Jews. So if we don't get any stages and any rooms, and if we don't get the possibilities or the okays for having events on the streets, we're missing education for the people who are non-Palestinian, for the German people, and we don't get the chance to talk about the Germans and all interest people about it. So it's basically just having small events, hidden small events, and just making them for the own people. But that's not what we actually want to reach. We want to educate the Germans about, even though the history of Palestine, and we have to keep talking about it. So that's why if you don't have the government back or any institutes, we keep on talking. So it's that's what Palestine Speaks is about. It speaks about Palestine, but it's hard if you don't get rooms and stages and places.
Indeed. Well, we're just going to go into a very, very short break for a few minutes, but we appreciate, of course, Hebh and Lubna for staying with us. We're going to be back, viewers, right after this break, continuing this discussion. As I said, I'm going to talk more about those rallies and about also what the solutions may be at this point in time for Palestinian, for discussions about Palestine openly in a country like Germany and even in other places across Europe. Please do stay with us. We'll be right back after this break, as I said, with Hebh, Jamal, and Lobna Shammout. Stay tuned, please. Welcome back, everyone, to The Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi, here on BMTV. We're still joined by Hebh, Jamal, and Lobna Shammout, and we continue to discuss the suppression of Palestinian voices in Germany. Now, Hebh, I wanted to bring up the issue of the rallies that have been suppressed recently, right? And I know that for a while now, Germany has been suppressing pro-Palestine rallies, right? But we especially saw that just recently, especially after the killing of Shirin Abu Akleh, a lot of the rallies that were suppressed quite brutally, right? So, and we have seen kettling as a police method in other countries as well, and that's being condemned by many others as well. But, you know, we've had harrowing accounts of many activists who were badly bruised, badly injured because of that kettling. But what are your thoughts about that? I mean, we're talking about at a time when Germany has just hosted the G7 countries, you know, these are countries where, at least in the mainstream, you never get that narrative that a country like this could ever actually do something like that against freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom to protest.
Right. I mean, we have to remember that in many ways, Germany, I feel, functions as a very undemocratic place for specific people. And those specific people, again, are Palestinians, also specifically in Berlin. How Germans view anti-Semitism, they actually don't view it from the form of like their history. They view it as imported by Palestinians, by Muslims, by foreigners. And this demonstration is just a clear example of how Germany specifically tries to suppress those voices in a very violent and undemocratic way. I mean, their justification for banning those Nakba Day protests was that there might be anti-Semitism. When I asked the German police, when I wrote about this, about why they believed, you know, that this deserved, you know, to be banned, and they said, oh, the perspective, you know, acting almost proactively to stop anti-Semitism. So they're actually just categorizing, the future of anything we do, our whole existence as anti-Semitic before we even act ourselves. And that day, as you saw, they were arresting people with kufiyas, they were arresting people who are, holding flags, even people that looked like they were about to go to a protest, they also arrested them, right? So it wasn't even people that were involved in a protest. There was a small flash mob that lasted 2 minutes, and everyone involved, the 50 people or 20 to 50 people that were involved in that small thing, all of them had to hand over their IDs to police and face further, persecution because of their involvement.
Okay, I'm being told by the studio that we in fact have a caller, so let's just listen to what the caller has to say. Hello, can you hear me?
Hello, Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum assalam. Please go ahead with your comment.
I have comment that when it was Ukraine war, there were big explosion of anger. Everything, all the provision of all the measurement of damage, risk, and everything being taken by world powers for Ukraine people. Why we see double standard for Palestinian people and all the Muslim nation? When Ukraine war, there is explosion of everything and all the necessary action being taken against Russia. Why don't they take against Israel? Why don't they take against United States? Why is that our anger is not counted, our risk, our damage, our nothing is being counted by these powers?
Indeed, and that's a very, very good point. Thank you for calling in. I will put that question to you, Lobna, because I in fact wanted to ask about that, so I'm very happy that the caller brought that up. But there is this very clear hypocrisy, isn't there? And this happened, in fact, right at the beginning of what happened in Ukraine. There were a lot of people asking that question, especially on social media, like, why is there this double standard? What are your thoughts on that?
First of all, when war started, I have been to a Europe meeting in Amsterdam from Palestinians all over Europe, and that was basically the main question in that event. Why is the double standard there? Why do people accept or have why do people accept the sanctions on Russia but do not accept the sanctions on Israel? The war and the guilt is the same, made from both countries. And you sure all even noticed the comments from different journalists having like, yeah, because they're blonde, they're your neighborhood, they're civilized, and at the same time saying that Palestinians aren't civilized, Palestinians are living in cages or in caves and have not studied and not learned. And that's right away bullying a whole nation and saying, okay, you're not worth having our grief with you, you're not worth having our support, and that's something that hurts really bad. The double standards, I think, come especially in Europe because Ukraine is so nearby. It basically can really be your neighbor. So it's so nearby that it gives many, many problems, and you're affected directly because everybody has kind of Russian or Ukrainian neighbors. They're on the same, it's Europe. So it was the same when we had in France a couple of years ago, there was a big terrorism act. Mm-hmm. And there was so much support, and it was because it's in Europe. At the same time, we had the war in Gaza, and nobody cared in Germany. So indeed. I think it's basically just geography. It's because it's your neighbor, it's somebody, and it's not far away enough.
Indeed. Hebh, what are your thoughts on that? Because this is the tale of two occupations, essentially, right? I mean, they keep calling it. Even von der Leyen has called what's happened in Ukraine an occupation by Russia. But then, why is that occupation bad, but the occupation of Palestinian territory is, okay?
Yeah, I mean, rationale and honestly, logic. it does, you can't really apply it when it comes to this specific context. I mean, if you walk down the streets, I kid you not, there was an actual almost glorifying poster here where I live in Mannheim of like actual Ukrainian civilian militant fighters. And I'm like, I mean, put that sentence together. Germany is glorifying militant fighters against an occupying force. I mean, if you kind of said that in almost any other context, you would be considered an extremist or a terrorist or a radical. But, when it comes to Ukrainians, it's of course justified. I think in Germany is also really important to acknowledge that we have, Germany is also having an influx of refugees from Afghanistan. But right now, there is an actual priority, and they said this, there's a priority to Ukrainian refugees. In Berlin, there was an actual refugee location center where Afghan refugees were relocated to actually make space for Ukrainian refugees. There was a memo that was sent out by German authorities to these assimilation departments or integration departments, where they basically said, you don't have to teach Ukrainians not to sit on the floor or how to use a dishwasher because they know how to do it because they're European, right? And so like this is to this extent is what Germany is really views foreigners. I mean, they think that they have to teach them not to sit on the floor, to eat or something, and that's a measure of their civility. And so I think like this whole situation, when we put it in context, it is really ridiculous, and it's of course a double standard. You could have as much sympathy as you want for Ukraine, but the reality is, Western nations value European lives more, and they refuse to see their participation in oppression elsewhere.
Lubna, I wonder, around the world, we have Germany and its many foreign policy arms, essentially espousing a stance of moral authority, right? So Germany goes around the world telling others what they can and cannot do, or should and should not do within their own societies. Do they not, or do you not think that they realize that they are probably losing a lot of those, that validity or that legitimacy in many people's eyes?
Honestly, no. I think because they're so close to Israel, and Israel is basically friends and cousins and brothers with the US, it's they're feeling safe. The German politics is like, okay, we have Israel on our side, so we have the US on our side, and we don't need more. So with those two big brothers on our side, we have the ability to keep telling other countries what to do or not to do, or if they don't follow us, it doesn't matter anyways, because we have our two allies and we have our two friends with us, and they're very powerful in the world politics, and that's the most important, I think.
So then, Hebh, in a sense, then the message to Palestinians and activists is that you're on your own. I mean, is that the right message to take away from this?
Of course, and not only that, there are very little institutions that will help you. I mean, I can give you two examples that I'd love to bring attention to. The first one is about, the Palestinian activist here in Germany, Ramses Kilani, who is a German Palestinian and who had his family, so his father and his 5 half-siblings, killed in the 2014 Gaza war by an Israeli airstrike. They were killed in their home after Israel told them to evacuate. They were killed in the Al Salam Tower. And the German federal prosecutor earlier this year just decided that they will not investigate, even though it is, by law, they would have to investigate because they're German citizens, but they refused to investigate the murder of his family. The second instance is about Dr. Anna Yunus, which is a German Palestinian academic here in Germany, who, had a secret dossier made against her by an anti-Semitism institution called Rias here. And this, institution literally sent this secret dossier to events and to God knows who to get her disinvited, to get her to not be involved in various events. And this strict self-censorship has made it almost impossible to seek justice here in Germany. I mean, it is almost impossible to find a German lawyer who will take your case even. And so I really think that although, yes, we are on our own, there are still fights being made. people still are on the streets. I mean, Palestine Speaks is an example of that. Palestinian activists are, here and present, and they will continue to be here and to fight for their rights.
I really appreciate your time, Hebh, and of course, Lobna as well. I will unfortunately have to leave it there at that, but we, as I said, really appreciate this discussion, and we'll hope to have this discussion again at a future date as well. Viewers, we appreciate you joining us as well, and of course, for calling in, and please, we do encourage you to call in again in the future. I'll be back, of course, next week with another hot topic of the day. Please do stay tuned for that show, but of course, send your comments in the meantime as well. Thank you very much for watching. I've been Waqar Rizvi for The Scope here on BMTV.